Thanks very much. And I'd like to start by saying I've put together a series of questions for this presentation. So I first would like to talk a little bit about how we explain the effects of education attainment on health outcomes, what social and emotional factors are affecting the lives of high school graduates, dropouts, certificate holders, and special populations, and what are the stresses and anxieties of college students in 2- and 4-year institutions, and what conflicts and pressures are affecting the everyday lives and future education plans of 24-year-olds. So I think first the most important thing to talk about is we typically think about education and its relationship to health, and we usually say, well, it's an issue of resources. It has to do with the fact that you have more income and you're more likely to have a better occupation. A better occupation, you're going to be insured, all the things that come along with having a better occupation. But it seems to me then there have been a series of new papers that have been written that have really kind of pushed the envelope about what is the effect of education on health. And the things that they are kind of pushing on are what some people have now referred to as non-cognitive skills, which of course I don't think there is such a thing, because everything is in cognition, or soft skills, which I don't like either, which is kind of mushy, ushy, gushy. But if we want to think about certain other kinds of things that are part of our emotional, social understandings of the world. And one of them, of course, are different thinking and decision-making patterns that improve critical thinking skills. And most recently, a very nice paper which has shown that it's the case that people who have more education are, in fact, more likely to trust in scientific evidence. And that becomes a really important part if you start thinking about what that means for health prevention. So I thought that one way to start thinking about everything might be to deal with the question about the transition process, which Rob, of course, described. And we know that the process is that what happens in high school is certainly going to have a huge impact on, again, what happens later on as you make this transition process. So if we look at the high school graduation rate, we know that it hasn't changed substantially since the 1970s. There's some controversy about this, but that really depends upon which cohort you're looking at, and if you're trying to look at that cohort's time in high school, whether you're going to do it on a 4-year pattern or if you're going to do it longer than a 4-year pattern. The dropout rate has decreased, but of course we know that for blacks that this is really, especially for black males, it's really a very serious problem. And particularly 70% of black male dropouts will spend time in prison by their mid-30s. Now, the actual dropout rate, the proportion of the population that has the highest dropout rate is those people that are Hispanic, followed by blacks, and then whites with, well, actually it's Hispanics, American Indians, blacks, and then whites, and then Pacific Islanders. So it seems to me that what we have to do right now is to try and think carefully about who are these populations in high school, because the high school situation follows you into the workforce, and it's going to have a huge impact on what happens to you in terms of where you go in post-secondary education. So let's talk a little bit about these people that are what I would call the ones that fail to complete high school within at least a 5 to 6 year period. These people, of course, are unable to find stable employment, health insurance, and they're very worrisome as a population simply because of all the health risks that we know are associated with them. And then there's some other kind of populations that kind of fall under the radar screen, which we have to really pay some attention to because many of the health-related issues are not being dealt with in the high school. So these would be groups of people such as refugees, because lots of refugees will come to U.S. high schools, such like Somalians. They will stay in the high school until they're 20, until they can get English skills. And then sometimes they'll move on to post-secondary education, and sometimes they'll just go directly into the workforce. But they will actually stay in the high school for as long as they legally can stay in the high school. And of course, the high schools today have absolutely no resources to help on any of these kind of health-related behaviors. They can barely help with kids getting to go to college. There's also the population of undocumented students. We've had a lot of conversation about this, but the one thing that we know about undocumented students is we really don't know how many there really are, simply because we're not allowed to count them. So since we can't count them and we can't verify how many there actually are, we really don't know what the effect is, and we don't know what the intergenerational effects of being undocumented are. Because you could actually be documented and your parents could be undocumented, and then there's the question, of course, of what's going to happen to you. And finally, there are the issues of those that are LGBTQ, because very often these are the victims of a lot of bullying that goes on within high schools, and some of these kinds of bullying, social and psychological issues that happen to young people when they're in high school move on as they move into secondary school. Now, one of the things that I thought was particularly important before we start to move into the question about what's going on in post-secondary school are the certificate holders. This is another population that's falling under the radar screen, because certificate holders are those people that might graduate from high school, might not graduate from high school, may start a 2-year institution, and these are people that are going to be your cosmetologists. These are going to be people who are going to get truckers' licenses. And for the most part, these are populations, again, that are relatively uninsured, that often enter into these occupations, that they have all kinds of associated health and psychological issues. And this is a population that I feel we really need to spend a lot more time, especially given the kinds of jobs that they're likely to have. In one of our studies, we interviewed a number of these people that were working in the shipyards. They are the ones that they're willing to take any kind of work, so they'll work at night. These are the people that are doing the 7-Eleven kinds of night shifts, the ones that are at any kind of fast food restaurant, and we know exactly that these people are also prone to violence that can happen, you know, in these kinds of situations. But what do we know really happens? Well, what we know really happens is that most young people, when they're in high school, think they're going to go to college. Now, I really would like you to pay a little bit of attention to this particular slide, because this is a point I'm going to come back to. These are people who all are seniors at different time points, and they are seniors in high school that were asked the same question of how far in school do you plan to get? And these were asked when they were in high school, and you'll see how that has gone up. This is what you get when you pay attention to cohort effects that are status effects, which I'm really concerned about a lot of the presentations today, because they talk about people 19 to 24. We cannot talk about people that are 19 to 24. People that are 19 to 24 fall into very different kinds of patterns. And I would like to go back to the very first speaker this morning who suggested that there are patterns. Well, yes, there are patterns, but these patterns are really what makes our lives as researchers all the more interesting, because we have to dissect those patterns and understand the variation within our populations. So as you can see from here, in fact, that everybody expects to go to college, but what happens is, one, we know they don't go. Why don't they go? Well, very often they're undermatched. They have misaligned ambitions. They all think that they're going to become doctors, lawyers, etc. They move into different kinds of post-secondary education experiences, and they're pretty much finding out that they don't reach what it is that they plan and need to look at. But even with that, what happens? Well, it turns out that 70% of kids do manage to go on to some sort of post-secondary education immediately following high school graduation. Now, you have to remember that I'm talking about those students that actually do graduate with a regular diploma. There are people that graduate with alternative diplomas, there are people that graduate with GEDs. This represents a different kind of population that filters into different places within the workforce and within the higher education marketplace. Now, in order to prepare for this presentation, I started to look at some health services that are given to college students. And one of the things that I found most problematic is that these are all self-reports, and none of them are verified through any kind of existing administrative data. And so what you get is when people ask students, well, did you do this, did you do this, did you do this? They all say, no, I didn't have this problem, I didn't have this problem. But then when you look at the responses in terms of what they say their friends did, whether they used marijuana, whether they had these kinds of problems, then the population distributions changed quite dramatically. So what is it about our two-year institution people? Well, our two-year institution people are typically people who think they're going to get a bachelor's degree. So they enter into two-year institutions with the expectation that they're going to get a bachelor's degree. And within a 6-year period, about 12% of them will actually get a two-year degree. 6 years. And why is that the case? Because many of the two-year people that enter into our two-year institutions, number one, they've already have low scores in high school on tests, they have low grades, they've already not been able to take advanced courses, so many of them will enter into the two-year institutions and find themselves in remedial courses. They have to pass those remedial courses to be able to matriculate to get to the associate's degree. Now, we recognize that there's so many problems in our two-year institutions today that there are a number of programs that are being put in place to help students, primarily the Carnegie Foundation in California. Lots of these places are doing a number of kinds of interventions to see if they can't speed the process by which we can get young people through the two-year degree process. The other thing about two-year degree people is that they tend to have to work. And so they hold part-time jobs. They are going to have many, oftentimes, families. In addition to this, they're not likely to be insured. The healthcare facilities at these two-year institutions are even worse than they are in high school. And so that these are people that are really severely at risk for all kinds of problems. In addition to that, the financial aid situation for these two-year institution goers is really also problematic. It isn't the case, but you say, well, it's cheaper. So if it's cheaper, well, you know, why are they in so much trouble? Because they take out personal loans and the kinds of work that they're able to find. And I appreciate the presentation by the person who did the economic work. These are jobs that don't pay enough. So they end up with enormous amounts of debt. They can't get through the courses, and we really have a very big problem with the number of young people that are in two-year institutions. Now, what happens to our four-year college institutions? Well, this is another area that I think we really need to spend a lot more time thinking about what's going on in four-year institutions today. There's a very nice book by Richard Aram and Josipa Rosinka that have to do with academically adrift. And what they show in this book is how the college experience varies by the type of institution that a young person goes into. And I think that this is something that we really want to be much more aware of. For example, in the less competitive institutions, young people will go into these institutions primarily because their friends are going there, they want to have a good time, they're going to do less homework, their ambitions, their understanding about what's going to happen to them when they graduate is pretty much in flux. Of course, then at the other end of the spectrum are those people who are very motivated, are very directed, are going to do really well in school, and are going to graduate on time. So I don't want you to think that everybody that goes to a four-year institution is a loafer and they really don't think hard about what's going to happen to them. But nonetheless, the spectrum of who's in our four-year institutions is really quite large. in addition to the fact that there's so many of these people that are in these institutions, 1 in 5 will not graduate within a 6-year period. So just imagine what the financial costs are to young people who are in institutions for this long a period of time. So anyway, you graduate. Then what happens? What happens to you once you graduate? And we've been doing a lot of work on looking at young people once they graduate, and I've been following 7,000 students over time. So what are some of the kinds of patterns that we see? Now, there's the small group of people, they knew all along, they did really well in school, they've already taken, you know, all of the kinds of things that they need to move on into graduate school and pursue their careers. But for the majority of the kids, most of them are really in a situation where they're going to take jobs that it's very hard to get a very well-paying job when you're 22 years old. A lot of them are very unclear about what it is that they want to do. Many of them are saddled with a lot of debt, so they really have to start thinking about moving into jobs that at least they're going to be able to start to pay off these huge college loans. Then a lot of them are going to start thinking, well, maybe I studied the wrong thing when I was in college, so maybe I should go back and get another kind of certificate. So we're seeing that, you know, this 22, 23, 24-year-old population is also now thinking about returning to school. Now, the situation of our young people today, this sort of situation where people are kind of not sure about where they're going, and this kind of difficult period of young adulthood is found also globally. We've just finished a major piece on looking at work throughout the globe, and you can see that this kind of pattern is one that you're seeing a lot of, not only in the US, but in other populations. So I'm looking at the timer, and I just want to kind of say at least some things that I've found during the presentations today. And I'd like to offer these as research issues. The first is to stop conflating these age and statuses. We need to conduct longitudinal cohort designs that allow for analyses of subgroups. And if there's one thing that I've taken away from this meeting, please, and this is from insurers to physical safety, no matter who you're looking at, if you're 19 and you're unemployed and you're just out there on the street compared to if you're 21 and you're at Princeton, your lives are very, very different. And it's time that we really started to make a much bigger thing of this. The second is we've got to stop relying entirely on these self-reports. They have to be verified in some way through some sort of administrative records, any kinds of other kinds of information that can be linked into data so that people start to get a better handle on, can these things, are they valid, can they be verified? The third is to conduct real randomized trials. We have a randomized trial that's going on right now, but I'm talking about real randomized trials and interventions with populations that, you know, are blocked randomized populations, so that when you do this kind of intervention work, it starts to make a lot of sense. And then finally, this question about technology. I'm sold on technology. So I've got a number of studies right now where I'm using smartphones. And I think that this is really important. Smartphones are really useful for moment-to-moment kinds of understandings about how young people are feeling. And we've got great data on well-being and physical health. So I have all of the confidence that, yes, smartphones are really giving us a picture in the world. In addition to this, I also know that the U.S. Armed Services and work that we're looking at right now, that by holding onto your phone, you're going to be able to get heartbeat information, other kinds of physical information, that the new technology that's coming out, I'm working with an engineer from Google, is really amazing in terms of what we're going to learn. And I don't want to dismiss this as an opportunity for us, but I also want us to be cautious about when we move into these things. I have a group of people I'm working with in Finland, and they're asking me to not only take pictures of student work with phones when we're doing moment-to-moment kinds of diary work, but they're also very big on face recognition. And so that if you take pictures of people's faces, that they can tell you something about their anxiety, how they're feeling at that particular moment. I've yet to see these, so I can't tell you whether or not they work or not, but I'm certainly interested in finding out about them. So overall, I feel that we are in an area, if we want to understand really about the health-related consequences of what this young adulthood period is about, that we really need to have a different orientation. And someone had suggested a different framework, and I would say the different framework works, because even though so much of this period young people are in school and continue to be in school, school has some kinds of constraints around behavior, but then there's some people that aren't in school, and when you are in school, you have very different kinds of conditions that are affecting your life. Thank you.
We've heard a lot of talk about the, I have to bend this up because you're a little bit shorter than I am. We've heard a lot of talk about the forgotten half, you know, that phrase, and I think which refers to the people that are not in college. And I think what Barbara has shown us is that even in the remembered half, there's a forgotten half of the remembered half that we need to pay attention to. Now, sticking with the not forgotten half of the not forgotten half, we're going to be talking about health on college campuses, and I think and so we have Shannon Bailey from the University of Washington who's going to do that, and I think she'll be talking a lot about what many college students think is the real purpose of going to college, which is booze and sex and eating very poorly and things like that. So, come on.